James Carter sat in his old rocking chair on the front porch of his small house, nestled in the quiet countryside. At 75 years old, he had seen and endured more than most could imagine. His face, lined with the marks of time and experience, carried a quiet dignity that only a man who had faced war and survived could possess. Above him, waving gently in the evening breeze, was his American flag. Not just any flag, but one that had been with him through his darkest days. It was the flag he had carried when he served in Vietnam, the one he had clung to when his best friend fell beside him, and the one that had been draped over his own father's coffin when he, too, had given his life in service. To James, this flag wasn't just fabric. It was his history, his sacrifice, and his honor. The town of Willow Creek was small, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. For decades, James had been a respected figure. People greeted him with warm smiles. Children listened to his war stories with wide eyes, and shopkeepers often refused to take his money, insisting that a hero shouldn't have to pay for coffee. But times were changing. A group of reckless teenagers had recently begun causing trouble in town. They loitered outside stores, played loud music, and had little respect for authority. While they hadn't done anything serious yet, they had an arrogance that didn't sit well with the town's older generation. James had noticed them before, laughing loudly as they spray-painted old buildings, tossing trash on sidewalks, and sneering at anyone who tried to correct them. "They'll grow out of it," he often told himself. "Just kids being kids." But deep down, a part of him worried about what the future held if respect and honor were slowly fading from society. One particular evening, as the sun set and the sky turned shades of orange and purple, James decided to turn in early. He had spent the day tending to his small garden and cleaning his front yard, as he always did. The flag outside his house was the last thing he looked at before going to bed, a silent reminder of everything he held dear. But that night, darkness brought something else. A group of 5 teenagers, led by a hot-headed troublemaker named Kyle, snuck through the quiet streets. Kyle, barely 19, had always been the leader of his group. He despised authority, hated being told what to do, and most of all, found joy in making others feel powerless. That evening, drunk on cheap beer and arrogance, they set their sights on James's flag. "Look at that old thing," Kyle sneered. "Why do these old people even care so much about a stupid piece of cloth?" One of his friends, hesitant, asked, "Man, are you sure? That guy's a war vet. People respect him." Kyle laughed. "So what? It's just a flag. It's time these old-timers learn that the past doesn't matter anymore." With that, Kyle grabbed a lighter from his pocket and approached the flagpole. With a flick of his wrist, a small flame appeared at the tip of the lighter. The others watched in shocked silence as he held the fire to the flag, the flames slowly licking at the edges of the fabric. First, nothing happened. Then, whoosh! The dry material caught fire, bright orange flames consuming the flag as it curled and disintegrated. The boys stood, mesmerized by the sight, not realizing the gravity of their actions. But across the street, a pair of eyes watched in horror. Old Mr. Thompson, James's neighbor, had stepped out for a late-night smoke when he saw what was happening. His heart pounded with fury as he ran back inside to call the sheriff. By the time the teenagers fled the scene, the once proud flag had been reduced to ashes, leaving behind only a few burnt fragments fluttering in the cold night breeze. The next morning, James woke up early, as always. He made himself a cup of coffee, stretched his stiff bones, and stepped outside for his usual morning routine. But the moment he looked up, his breath caught in his throat. His flag was gone. All that remained were blackened remnants of fabric scattered on the ground. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at the ashes, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Then, something inside him broke. This wasn't just vandalism. This was a direct attack on everything he had fought for, everything he had bled for. James knelt down, his fingers brushing over the ashes, and for the first time in many years, his eyes filled with tears. Across the street, Mr. Thompson, along with a few other neighbors, had gathered. Their expressions were a mix of anger and sadness. "James, we saw who did it," Mr. Thompson finally spoke. "It was those kids. That Kyle and his gang. I already called the sheriff, but we all know they'll probably get a slap on the wrist." James took a deep breath. He wasn't one to seek revenge. But this couldn't go unanswered. He stood up, his hands tightening into fists. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back inside. A few moments later, he emerged, holding his old military phone book. And then, with steady hands and a firm expression, he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The number of a man who owed him a favor. The number of someone who could change everything. As the phone rang, the townspeople watched in silence, knowing that something big was about to happen. James Carter stood on his front porch, the burnt remnants of his flag scattered on the ground like the remains of a broken promise. His face was stoic, but inside, a storm raged. His old hands, hardened by war and labor, held the receiver of his landline phone tightly. The line rang twice, then a deep, authoritative voice answered. "Colonel Matthews speaking." James took a deep breath. "It's Carter." There was a brief pause on the other end before the voice softened. "James? My God, it's been years. How are you, old friend?" James didn't waste time. "I need a favor." A serious tone replaced the friendliness in Matthew's voice. "What's going on?" James glanced at the blackened remains of his beloved flag, took another breath, and explained. He told Matthews about the teenagers, the fire, and the blatant disrespect. There was silence on the line before Matthews spoke again. "That's unacceptable. And you're right, this can't go unanswered." "What can you do?" James asked. Matthews let out a slight chuckle. "You forget who I am, Carter? I don't just sit behind a desk. I still have influence. I've got friends in high places, some in law enforcement, some in politics. And let's not forget the old boys from our unit." James finally cracked a small smile. "I'll make a few calls," Matthews continued. "But I want you to do something too." "What's that?" "Go down to the sheriff's office. Let them know you're pressing charges. No more letting things slide. And make sure the town knows what happened. If these kids think they can get away with this, they need to learn just how wrong they are." James nodded. "Understood. Good. I'll be in touch soon." "And James?" "Yeah. They messed with the wrong man." With that, the call ended. James set the phone down and exhaled. The weight of what had happened still pressed heavily on him. But now, there was a plan. A few hours later, James made his way into town, his boots clanking against the wooden floor of the small sheriff's station. The moment he walked in, the room fell silent. Officers who had known James for years stopped what they were doing, their eyes shifting from him to the anger written on his face. Sheriff Tom Reynolds, a gruff but fair man in his 50s, stood from behind his desk. "James," he said, motioning for him to sit. "I already know why you're here." James remained standing. "Then you know I'm pressing charges." Reynolds sighed. "I get it. And trust me, I want these kids to face justice as much as you do. But you know how this town works. Their parents have influence. Kyle's dad owns half the businesses in town. He'll probably pull some strings, maybe get them off with community service." James leaned forward, his eyes burning with intensity. "Not this time, Tom." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded. "All right, I'll make the arrests." But James wasn't done. "And I want a public statement. I want this town to know exactly what happened. I want them to see the faces of the punks who disrespected a veteran." Sheriff Reynolds scratched his chin. "That might put pressure on the mayor. He won't like it." James smirked. "Good." Reynolds exhaled sharply. "All right, James. I'll do it." Just as James turned to leave, the phone on the sheriff's desk rang. Reynolds picked up. "Sheriff's office." A second later, his posture stiffened. "Yes, sir. Understood." James raised an eyebrow. "Who was that?" The sheriff slowly put the phone down, staring at James with a look of utter shock. "That was the governor's office," Reynolds muttered. "And they just told me. The National Guard is getting involved." James smiled slightly. Matthews had come through. The next day, the town square was buzzing with whispers and outrage. Kyle and his gang had been arrested, something no one thought would ever happen. The sheriff had made a public statement about the destruction of the flag, calling it an act of unpatriotic vandalism and a disgrace to those who served. Photos of the burnt flag and the mugshots of the teens were plastered all over social media. And then, the unexpected happened. Veterans from across the state, hundreds of them, began arriving in town. Some wore old uniforms, some carried flags, and all of them were furious. They weren't just here to support James. They were here to make sure justice was served. The media caught wind of the story, and suddenly, what had been a local incident turned into national news. Kyle and his gang had gone viral for all the wrong reasons. Their families, once respected, now found themselves shunned by the community. Businesses refused to serve them. Neighbors refused to speak to them. Kyle's father, who had once bragged about his wealth and influence, now stood outside his store as customers walked past without a second glance. He tried to pull strings to get the charges dropped, but now, with the whole country watching, he was powerless. And as James watched the fallout unfold, he knew this wasn't over yet, because tomorrow he would stand before the entire town and say what needed to be said. James Carter stood in his front yard at dawn, looking at the burnt remains of his beloved flag. He had fought for that flag, had watched brothers in arms die defending it, and now a group of entitled kids had burned it as if it meant nothing. But they had made a mistake because it meant everything. And today they would learn just how much. By noon, hundreds of people had gathered at the town square. Veterans, active duty soldiers, law enforcement officers, and proud patriots from across the state had flooded into town after hearing James' story. The local news had set up cameras, and a national news crew had arrived to broadcast the event live. Kyle and his gang, now released on bail, stood off to the side with their families. Their parents, once powerful figures in town, now looked ashamed and powerless. The sheriff's official statement had turned public opinion against them. Businesses had banned them, their former friends had cut ties, and the entire town now looked at them with disgust. At exactly 1 p.m., Sheriff Reynolds took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming," he began, his voice steady. "We are gathered here today because a great wrong was committed. An American flag, a flag that belonged to a veteran who served his country with honor, was burned in an act of senseless vandalism." A murmur of anger rippled through the crowd. "This town was built on respect," Reynolds continued. "Respect for our elders, respect for our country, and most importantly, respect for those who have defended it." The crowd cheered in agreement. The sheriff turned to James. "And there is no one more deserving of our respect than James Carter." A thunderous round of applause erupted as James stepped forward. The old veteran adjusted the microphone, scanning the crowd. He had spoken at memorial services, military funerals, and veteran events, but today this was different. "This flag," James began, holding up a newly folded American flag in his hands, "is more than just fabric. It is a promise. Promise that we, as Americans, stand together. A promise that we protect one another. And when that promise is disrespected, we don't just sit back and let it happen." The crowd cheered louder. "I fought in Vietnam," James continued, his voice growing stronger. "I watched good men die for this flag. I carried my wounded brothers on my back, knowing that even if we didn't make it home, this flag would still be there, because it represents something greater than any of us." Some in the crowd wiped their eyes. Veterans in the front row stood at attention, saluting him. "And yet," James said, his gaze landing on Kyle and his friends, "we have young men in this town who think they are above respect, who think that the sacrifices of those before them mean nothing." Kyle shifted uncomfortably, looking down. James paused, letting his words sink in. "I won't stand for it," he declared, "and neither will this town." A roar of approval echoed through the square. James looked to the sheriff. "I want every one of them to apologize publicly." Sheriff Reynolds nodded and motioned for Kyle and his gang to step forward. Kyle and his friends looked terrified. The same arrogance they had displayed the night before was gone. Now, they stood in front of hundreds of people, their faces red with humiliation. Kyle's father, once one of the most influential businessmen in town, now looked at his son with disappointment and shame. One by one, the teenagers were forced to take the microphone. I'm sorry, one of them muttered. Loud boos came from the crowd. James narrowed his eyes. Say it like you mean it. Kyle took a deep breath and grabbed the microphone. His voice shook. I'm sorry for what we did. We disrespected something we didn't understand. We didn't think about what it meant to people like you. James stared at him for a moment before nodding. And, Kyle swallowed hard. And we'll do whatever it takes to make it right. James turned to the sheriff. They're going to clean the Veterans Memorial. Every single one. And they'll do it under supervision. The sheriff smirked. Consider it done. The crowd erupted in applause. Just when it seemed like the event was ending, an official-looking man in a suit stepped onto the stage. The cameras turned toward him as he approached James. He cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, my name is Senator William Price, and I represent this district. I heard about what happened, and I wanted to be here personally. James raised an eyebrow. Senator. The man smiled. You see, when word got out about what these boys did, I received a flood of messages from veterans across the state. They all told me the same thing, that your service, your story, and your character deserve more recognition. James frowned. I don't do this for recognition, son. The senator nodded. I know. That's why I spoke with the governor. And starting next month, your name will be added to the state's Veterans Hall of Honor. The crowd gasped. James' eyes widened. What? The senator smiled. You deserve it, sir. And as a special tribute, the town has arranged for a new flagpole to be installed in front of your home. One that will fly a flag gifted directly from the U.S. Capitol. James blinked rapidly, fighting the emotion welling in his chest. He had fought wars, seen friends die, and survived things that most people couldn't imagine. But this moment, right here, was something he never expected. The crowd erupted into cheers, whistles, and applause. Veterans lined up to shake James' hand, some saluting, others hugging him like a brother. And as the American flag was raised high once more, James Carter stood tall, knowing that his message had been heard loud and clear. The next morning, Kyle and his friends arrived at the town's Veterans Memorial, their faces filled with dread. The punishment had been swift and unforgiving. They would be spending every weekend for the next 6 months cleaning every veterans monument in town. Under the watchful eyes of the sheriff, volunteers, and local veterans, they had no choice but to face the consequences of their actions. James Carter stood nearby watching them work. Kyle, now stripped of his arrogance, scrubbed the stone monument with trembling hands. He wasn't used to this kind of labor, and it was clear he despised every moment of it. After hours of scrubbing, Kyle finally looked up and met James' gaze. For the first time, there was no defiance, only regret. James walked over, crossing his arms. Hurts, doesn't it? Kyle wiped sweat from his brow. Yeah. James nodded. That's what respect is, kid. Something you earn. And you just learned the hard way that disrespect comes with a price. Kyle swallowed hard, then looked away in shame. Meanwhile, the town was still buzzing with energy after the previous day's event. People from neighboring towns came to show support. Veterans organizations began raising funds to restore and improve the local war memorial, and donations poured in from all over the country. James became an unexpected local hero. People stopped him on the street to shake his hand, offer him free meals, or simply thank him for his service. Even the governor personally called him, expressing gratitude for his years of service and his continued impact on his community. James was humbled by the attention. He had never asked for recognition, only respect for the sacrifices of those who had served before and after him. One evening, weeks later, James was sitting on his front porch when he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Kyle standing at the foot of his steps, his hands in his pockets, looking nervous. James raised an eyebrow. Back again. Kyle took a deep breath. I wanted to say something. James gestured toward the empty chair beside him. Go on. Kyle hesitated before sitting down. I know an apology doesn't fix what I did. But I want you to know. I get it now. He looked up at James. I was raised thinking I was better than other people, that my last name meant I didn't have to respect anyone. But I was wrong. James studied him for a long moment. Took you long enough. Kyle chuckled awkwardly. Yeah, I guess it did. After a moment of silence, Kyle reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, folded American flag. James' eyes narrowed. Kyle placed it on the table between them. I bought it myself. I know it can't replace the one I destroyed, but I wanted to give it to you anyway. James looked at the flag, then back at Kyle. He could see it, the genuine remorse in the young man's eyes. For the first time since the incident, James allowed himself to let go of the anger. You've still got a lot to learn, kid, he said, picking up the flag. But this is a start. Kyle nodded. I know, James smirked. And don't think this gets you out of cleaning the rest of those memorials. Kyle grinned, shaking his head. Wouldn't dream of it. As for Kyle's parents, they faced their own reckoning. The town, disgusted by their entitlement and lack of accountability, cut all business ties with them. Their influence crumbled, and within months, their company suffered massive losses. Rumors spread that they were considering leaving town altogether, unable to handle the public shame of their son's actions. And Kyle? He finished his punishment, spending every weekend cleaning the memorials. But something changed along the way. He began listening to the veterans' stories, learning their experiences, and understanding the weight of the sacrifices made. By the end of his punishment, he had become a different person. On Veterans Day, James stood proudly in front of his house as his brand new flagpole was raised. The flag, gifted from the U.S. Capitol, fluttered majestically in the wind. Hundreds of people gathered for the ceremony. Veterans stood at attention. Townspeople cheered. And in the front row, Kyle stood with them, no longer a boy filled with arrogance, but a young man who had finally learned the meaning of honor and respect. As the flag rose high, James Carter saluted, knowing that his battle was won. Not with fists, not with anger, but with unwavering dignity, resilience, and a lesson that would never be forgotten.